Alright, so this video we're going to go over frame rate and temporal resolution. Let's go over this real quick. So temporal resolution is basically reliant on the frame rate. When you talk about temporal resolution, you basically are talking about frame rate. So when we think about frame rate, that's just how many images are displayed for every second on our monitor. And that's expressed in hertz, cycles per second. Our monitor will actually flash images. If you know anything about the way movies are made, you think back to the old timey and they record on film. They record one piece of film and then play them in quick succession, and that gives us a moving image. Old film typically was 24 or less frames per second. Right now, if you go to a movie, it's going to play at about 24 frames a second. If you've ever seen fast moving video, this would be more sports. A lot of time it's filmed at 30 or 60 frames per second because, let's say, a football is moving so fast. If it's at 24, it'll look blurry or choppy. So if you look at this little image here, you can see how at 10 frames per second, you're just getting one frame, and then there's a lot of missing information before the next frame. And you go down to 30, and you can see how if there's a structure moving, you'll still miss some information, but you'll get a lot of it. So at 60 frames per second, you're almost at 100% of information, where you're not missing anything in between. So the frames will show you an image, and then it'll wait, and then show you another image. So while it's waiting, there's actually information going by, whether it's a moving heart or some structure in the body, maybe blood in a Doppler image, that's moving by before the next frame is shown. I'm going to play this little animation, and you can actually see at 12.5 frames per second, you can see how it's jittery and it kind of jumps. And a lot of times when you have an image that you're imaging deep with a lot of focal zones, full screen, you're going to have a jerky image like this. Let's say you decrease the depth and you take away a focal zone, it'll smooth out a little bit, and you'll notice your image gets crisper and seems smoother. So when we think about temporal resolution, most structures are displayed on the screen in 2 or 3 dimensions. So we're thinking depth, width, and then time. When we think about the frames, those are all created, as the pulse. It'll pulse, create a line, and then it'll display one line. High definition, it could be 720p. If you've ever bought a new TV, it's like 1080p, or now it's 4K. What that's talking about is how many lines are on the screen. Our screens on our machines are typically 720, so that would be 720 lines across the whole screen. So on the imaging portion, when we're looking at our sector, each line is a pulse. So when the machine pulses once, it's going to create one line and put them side by side. And all that takes time. So as the machine creates all those pulses and puts them side by side, it can only do it so fast, especially if we're trying to ask it to do more things. So when we think about temporal resolution, it's the time from the beginning of one frame to the next frame. So if it takes, a 30th of a second to make one frame, then it can play 30 frames per second. But if we ask it to do more, we increase the depth, add focal zones. Maybe it'll take 3/30ths of a second, so it can only produce 10 frames every second. And that will decrease our frame rate and decrease our temporal resolution. So I keep going over these because these are the things I really want you to remember. A high frame rate and good temporal resolution are impacted by 3 things: how deep you image, how many focal zones you have, and how many scan lines you have. So the more you ask of the machine, image deeply, more focal points, because every focal point is another pulse. So if you add one focal point, you're doubling how much work the machine has to do, and most likely halving your temporal resolution. Okay, so talking about frame rate, let's talk about a couple things that can change it. So if we're imaging, let's say this is our image sector, or however we're imaging. If we want to image, let's say, a structure that's deep, and let's say this is at 20 centimeters, so pretty deep. Imagine there's 100 different crystals here. Each one has to fire a pulse and wait for it to reach the back, full depth, and then it returns. So you have to wait that whole time. So the machine will pulse every single crystal wait for it to return, and then it will create one frame. So if you wait all that time to create one frame, this is why depth is such a big issue. So if we're imaging here and we decrease our depth, and now we're at like 5 cm, the time to reach the back and return is going to be much less. So that's why decreasing the depth will have such a big impact on frame rate. Another issue would be, let's say you do have a structure here and you place your focal point here. The pulse still reaches the back because it does have to image the whole thing, but because it's focusing here, that's going to be one pulse. But if you had another focal zone here, let's say there's structures throughout, you're just trying to get a good clean image, and you put in 3 focal zones, that's going to be 3 separate pulses. So you're going to decrease your frame rate mathematically by 1/3. It noticeably will notice it go down. So every frame rate is going to decrease your frame rate and your temporal resolution. So if you notice you're trying to, let's say you have a fetus in here and you're trying to image this little heart that's sitting in here, and you have 2 focal zones. This one right here is unnecessary because it's gonna be just taking an extra pulse to image up here that we're not, in an area that we're not even concerned with. So when trying to image a fast moving structure like that, put your 1 focal zone, decrease your depth, make sure there's no extraneous information behind, because you really have to, basically you're trying to maximize for temporal resolution. So remove focal zones, decrease your depth. The other thing would be, so again, if we're imaging this little heart here, we have 1 focal zone, we decrease our depth, but all of this information here is extraneous as well. So what you can do is mag up on this, and so you zoom up where you have all the information you need, and that's it. So the machine can disregard all of this extra information up here, and it'll just pulse to here. The time still takes the same, but a lot of this other processing is removed. So that's why zooming in on an area or magging up on it will cause your frame rate to increase, because the machine doesn't have to worry about all this other extra information. So to increase your temporal resolution, just remember these 3 things. You want to reduce your depth, so you want to make your image as shallow as possible while still retaining all of the information you need. Don't cut off anything. You're going to decrease your focal zones because you only want the ones that are necessary. If you're imaging 1 structure, put 1 focal zone, maybe 2 if you have to. And then reduce your scan lines, whether it's zooming in to a smaller area, or making your sector narrow, because you'll remove all this extraneous information on the sides. And rather than having 120 pulses, you may only have 50. So that helps as well. Another thing I like to do is, if let's say you're imaging, we're doing a pediatric patient. This is a 2-year-old. Of course he's not happy to be on the table, so he's screaming and moving, and you want to see his kidneys. A lot of times what I would do is I would take a cine clip as I scan through the kidney, and then I would freeze, and then I would scroll back through and find the image that I need. So what does that have to do with temporal resolution? Well, as I'm scanning, if my temporal resolution is high, each of those images will be clearer than if it's not. So zoom in on the baby's kidney, get 1 focal zone in there, make this as narrow as possible, or actually zoom in on it, and then take your cine through it. And this is what they do a lot in echo. They'll use cine clips to scroll back and look at the heart, because it's a fast moving structure. You optimize for your temporal resolution to give you really clear images on your cine clip. If your temporal resolution's low and you only have 10 frames a second, as you scan through that kidney, there's going to be missing information, so some of those intermediate frames will be blurry. But if you're at a good frame rate, you're at 24 or 30, and you scan through for 1 second, you're going to have 30 images that most likely are clear. Alright, thanks for watching this video. If you want more content like this, we have many more videos and study guides, including practice tests and flashcards. Just visit us at examrefresh.com.